A bright afternoon sun poured over the small town cafe, where locals gathered for coffee, small talk, and a sense of community. But today, that warm and friendly atmosphere was about to be shattered. As a decorated black veteran walked through the doors, seeking nothing more than a cup of coffee and a moment of rest, an unsettling tension filled the air. Behind the counter stood the cafe owner, a man whose scowl seemed permanently etched into his face. He glanced at the veteran, not with a welcoming smile, but with a look that made it clear he wasn't happy to see him. Without hesitation, the owner marched over, his voice sharp and cutting, making it known the veteran wasn't welcome there. Conversations in the cafe froze mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to the unfolding scene. The veteran, calm and dignified, tried to reason with the owner, explaining his service and sacrifice for the very country that allowed this cafe to exist. But the owner wasn't listening. His voice grew louder, his words harsher, as he demanded the man leave immediately. What the owner didn't know, however, was that someone was watching, a person who wasn't just another customer. They were someone with the power to change everything, someone who would make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. In the moments that followed, lives would be changed, lessons would be learned, and the true meaning of respect and humanity would be put to the test. But just who was watching, and what would they do about it? Stick around to find out. As the cafe owner stood firm, his harsh words echoing through the small room, the veteran remained calm, his military discipline showing in the way he held himself. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He only wanted a cup of coffee. His uniform jacket, worn proudly, bore patches and medals that told stories of bravery and sacrifice. But it seemed the cafe owner was too blinded by prejudice to see that. The customers around them sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the veteran and the owner. A couple of them whispered to each other, but no one dared to step in. The air was thick with tension, and it felt like time had slowed down. In a booth near the back of the cafe, a man sat quietly, watching everything unfold. He was dressed simply, his cap pulled low over his face. But there was something about his presence that commanded attention, if only anyone had noticed him. He didn't say a word, just observed, his eyes sharp and unwavering. The cafe owner, oblivious to the onlooker, continued his tirade. "I run a respectable business here," he barked, his voice growing louder. "We don't need any troublemakers." The veteran stood silently for a moment, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the customers, seeking even a flicker of support. But most of them avoided his gaze, choosing to stay silent. Little did anyone know, the quiet man in the booth wasn't just an ordinary customer. He had seen enough and was about to take action that would leave everyone in the cafe questioning their choices and their humanity. The veteran's composure never wavered, but the sting of the owner's words was evident in his eyes. He stood tall, a silent reminder of what he had endured and the principles he had fought for. Still, the owner's words kept coming, a stream of misguided anger rooted in ignorance. The veteran finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his frustration. "I didn't fight for a country that only serves some of its people," he said. "I fought for all of us." A murmur rippled through the cafe. A young woman near the counter shifted in her seat, looking down at her coffee cup as if it held the answers. An older man near the door coughed awkwardly, his hand gripping his cane. Everyone could feel the injustice of the situation, but the silence in the room spoke louder than any words. Meanwhile, the man in the booth leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. He picked up his phone, not to text or scroll, but to record. The lens focused on the confrontation, capturing every word, every look, and every uncomfortable silence from the bystanders. This wasn't just a personal moment. It was a reflection of something bigger, something he knew people needed to see. Back at the counter, the veteran glanced around the room, searching for any sign of solidarity. His gaze landed on a teenage boy sitting with his mother. The boy looked back, wide-eyed, as if wanting to speak up, but not knowing how. The tension in the cafe was suffocating, and yet no one moved. No one spoke. The quiet observer in the booth, however, had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away unnoticed. The air in the cafe was heavy, every second stretching unbearably. The veteran's calm demeanor was unwavering, but a flicker of pain crossed his face as he took one last glance around the room. No one stood up. No one spoke out. The teenage boy he had locked eyes with looked down at the table, his fingers nervously tracing circles on the edge of his plate. The cafe owner crossed his arms, a smug smile creeping onto his face, as if he had won some unspoken battle. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said, his voice dripping with finality. "Now leave." The man in the booth shifted, his phone still recording. His expression darkened as the scene continued to unfold. He had seen enough moments like this, moments where prejudice went unchecked, moments where good people stayed silent out of fear. He wasn't just watching a confrontation. He was watching a choice being made by every single person in that room. Just as the veteran turned to leave, the cafe's door opened, and a gust of cold air swept through. A woman walked in, her heels clicking on the tiled floor, her sharp gaze taking in the scene. She looked to the counter, her brows furrowing at the sight of the veteran's back as he prepared to walk out. Her voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. "Wait a second. What's going on here?" The cafe owner turned to her, his smugness faltering slightly. "It's nothing," he muttered, brushing off her question. But she wasn't buying it. The man in the booth sat up straighter, his phone still capturing every moment. The woman's sharp tone demanded attention, and the cafe fell silent once again. The veteran stopped mid-step, turning slightly to glance at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. She wasn't just another customer. There was something commanding about her presence, as though she had walked into situations like this before and knew exactly how to handle them. I said, "What's going on here?" She repeated, her voice calm but firm. The cafe owner shifted uncomfortably, the confidence he had moments ago visibly cracking. "It's nothing, just a misunderstanding," he stammered, trying to wave it off. But the woman wasn't convinced. Her gaze swept over the room, noticing the awkward, guilty expressions of the patrons and the quiet dignity of the veterans standing near the door. Then her eyes locked on the man in the booth, who had put his phone down momentarily, but was still watching intently. A silent exchange passed between them, as if she knew he was more involved than he appeared. Before the cafe owner could usher her to a table, she stepped forward and addressed the veteran directly. "Sir, did he just ask you to leave?" she asked, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The veteran hesitated, glancing around the room again. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what had just unfolded. The cafe owner sputtered, "I have every right." But before he could finish, the woman cut him off. "Rights are one thing. Respect is another," she said sharply. Then turning back to the veteran, she added, "You shouldn't have to leave. You've earned the right to be here more than most of us." And then it happened. The man in the booth stood, his quiet demeanor giving way to something resolute. "She's right," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "And if you think this is staying behind closed doors, you're wrong." He held up his phone, revealing the recording. The cafe owner's face went pale. The room buzzed with nervous energy as everyone realized the gravity of what was happening. The stakes had just been raised, and no one knew what would come next. The cafe fell silent as the man in the booth held his phone steady, the recording still playing on the screen. The weight of his words hung in the air. "This isn't just about you anymore," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about the choices we make when we think no one's watching." The cafe owner, now visibly shaken, stammered, "You can't just. This is my business. You have no right to record me." But the man's calm demeanor didn't falter. "Your business. That veteran fought for your right to have this business," he replied, his words hitting like a hammer. Before the owner could respond, the woman stepped in again. "And who do you think he is?" she asked, motioning toward the man in the booth. The owner looked confused, as did most of the cafe. The man gave a small, knowing smile, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. The collective gasp from the room was immediate. "Agent Lewis," he said, introducing himself. "Civil Rights Division." He turned to the veteran. "Sir, I've been documenting incidents like this, and let me assure you, this one won't be ignored." The cafe owner stumbled backward, his earlier bravado crumbling. "I didn't mean anything by it," he sputtered, panic creeping into his voice. I just thought." "Thought what?" the woman interjected. "That you could treat someone this way without consequence." Agent Lewis nodded toward the veteran. "Would you like to file a formal complaint, sir?" The veteran paused, his eyes scanning the room. Slowly, he shook his head. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I think he's learned his lesson. But everyone here, they need to think about the silence that allowed this to happen." As the veteran walked toward the door, Agent Lewis followed, but not before turning back to the cafe. "Next time, do better," he said. Just as the door closed behind them, the teenage boy, inspired by the moment, stood up and said, "Wait." Everyone turned to him as he added nervously, Can I pay for his coffee?" The unexpected gesture brought a stunned silence, followed by a slow ripple of applause from the patrons. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a start, a sign that change might be possible after all. The cafe was quiet for a moment after the teenage boy's offer, but then the applause grew louder, filling the space with a sense of hope. The veteran, who had stopped just outside the door, turned back briefly. His expression softened as he gave the boy a nod of appreciation. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than any grand speech ever could. Inside, the cafe owner stood frozen, his earlier confidence reduced to shame. The woman who had stepped in gave him a pointed look. "Sometimes," she said, "the best way to fix a mistake is to start treating people with the respect they deserve. You might want to think about that." Without waiting for a response, she walked out, leaving the owner to reflect on everything that had just happened. The man in the booth, Agent Lewis, followed, but not before turning back one last time. "I'll be watching," he said, his tone calm but firm. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. As the door closed behind him, the patrons began to talk quietly among themselves. Some seemed embarrassed they hadn't stepped in, while others expressed admiration for the veteran's composure and the courage of those who had intervened. For the veteran, it wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about the lesson, the reminder that silence can be as harmful as the words spoken in anger. And for everyone in that cafe, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. Sometimes change starts with a single voice breaking the silence. And in that small cafe, on that seemingly ordinary day, change had found its way in. All eyes were now on her, the energy in the room shifting. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything.